Have you ever felt that prickle on your neck? That feeling when you know you're being judged, not for who you are, but for what someone thinks you are. We've all had those moments. But for one woman, a brilliant and accomplished professional, heading home after a long week, that moment of prejudice would unfold at 35,000 feet. She was calmly sitting in the first-class seat she had paid for, when a flight attendant with a saccharine smile and ice in her eyes decided she didn't belong. The demand was simple: give up your seat. What followed was anything but. This isn't just a story about a confrontation on an airplane. It's a story about hidden power corporate rot and the kind of blinding, life-altering karma that strikes when you underestimate the person sitting in seat 2A. The hum of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was a familiar symphony to Dr. Evelyn Hayes. It was the sound of beginnings and endings, of hurried reunions and long goodbyes. For Evelyn, it was the sound of an ending, the conclusion of a grueling 4-day conference on aviation safety protocols, where she had been a keynote speaker. Her mind was a whirlwind of variable calculus and material stress tolerances, and all she wanted was the quiet solitude of her flight home to San Francisco. Her ticket for Ascendair Flight 812 was for seat 2A, a window seat in the first-class cabin. It was a luxury she didn't indulge in often, but after this week she had decided she'd earned it. The extra legroom was a welcome relief for her 5'10" frame, and the promise of minimal disturbance was worth every penny. Evelyn was a woman who moved with a quiet, confident grace that often belied the sheer force of her intellect. At 42, she was one of the nation's leading aerospace engineers and a senior air safety investigator for the Federal Aviation Administration. She had spent 2 decades peering into the twisted metal of tragedies, decoding the final black box whispers of downed aircraft to ensure such disasters never happened again. Her work was her life, a solemn vow made to the skies and to every soul who trusted them. Today, however, she was just a passenger. She boarded the aircraft, her simple but elegant black pantsuit standing in contrast to the more casual attire of other travelers. She gave a polite nod to the flight attendant at the door and made her way to her seat. Stowing her leather briefcase in the overhead bin, she settled into the plush leather, the scent of sanitized air and jet fuel filling her senses. She pulled out a well-worn copy of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, a comfort read that helped her decompress. The boarding process continued its controlled chaos around her. A young couple giddy with vacation excitement settled across the aisle. An older businessman in 1A was already tapping away furiously on his laptop. The atmosphere was one of impersonal, transient peace. Then Brenda Miller entered the first-class cabin. Brenda was a senior flight attendant, a fact she wore like a military decoration. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe shellacked bun, and her smile, though wide, never quite reached her eyes. She moved through the cabin with an air of proprietary authority, her gaze sweeping over the passengers, making silent, instantaneous assessments. When her eyes landed on Evelyn, they lingered for a fraction of a second too long. It was a flicker of something surprise. Disapproval Evelyn, engrossed in her book, didn't notice. Brenda began her pre-departure service, offering drinks with a practiced, almost robotic charm. "Can I get you something to drink before we take off, Sir Ma'am?" Her voice was sweet, but there was a brittle edge to it. When she got to Evelyn's seat, her tone shifted, becoming just a little less warm. "Anything for you?" she asked, her smile tightening. "Just some water, please." "No ice," Evelyn replied, looking up from her book with a warm, genuine smile of her own. Brenda nodded curtly and moved on. Evelyn dismissed the interaction. Flight attendants were busy, often stressed. She didn't take it personally. She was a woman of logic and data, not one to read malice into fleeting social cues. It was a miscalculation that would soon become glaringly apparent. As the last of the passengers trickled in, a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, paused at the front of the cabin, looking flustered. She clutched a boarding pass for a seat in the main cabin. She had blonde hair, wore expensive-looking athletic wear, and was talking animatedly to Brenda. Evelyn could only catch snippets of the conversation, words like uncomfortable and so long. Brenda's expression transformed. She was suddenly a beacon of sympathy and understanding, patting the young woman's arm reassuringly. "Don't you worry one bit, Tiffany. We'll get this sorted out. We'll find you a much more comfortable seat up here with us." Brenda's eyes scanned the first-class cabin again. They passed over the businessman in 1A, the vacationing couple, and then, like a magnet finding its pole, they locked onto Evelyn Hayes. This time there was no ambiguity. Her gaze was cold, calculating, and filled with a decision already made. The quiet hum of the cabin was about to be shattered. Brenda approached seat 2A, her professional smile plastered back on her face. Tiffany, the young passenger, hovered a few feet behind her, looking uncertain. "Ma'am," Brenda began, her voice dripping with a cloying sweetness that set Evelyn's teeth on edge. "I have a small favor to ask of you." Evelyn placed her bookmark carefully in her book and gave Brenda her full attention. "Yes, how can I help?" "Well, this young lady here, Tiffany Varha," Brenda said, gesturing back to the girl, "is feeling a bit anxious about the flight, and she'd be much more comfortable with a little extra space. We were hoping you wouldn't mind swapping seats with her. Her seat is 14B. It's a middle seat, but I'm sure it's perfectly fine." Evelyn's eyebrows rose slightly. She looked from Brenda's unwavering, expectant face to the young woman who now looked deeply uncomfortable, and then back to Brenda. The request was on its face, absurd. "Swap a first-class window seat for a middle seat in economy. I'm sorry," Evelyn said, her tone polite but firm. "I paid for this seat, and I'd like to remain here." Brenda's smile faltered for a microsecond before it was reinforced this time with a harder, more patronizing edge. "Oh, I understand, sweetheart, but it would really help us all out. It's just a seat after all. We need to be considerate of other passengers' needs." The word sweetheart was a tiny barb expertly deployed. Evelyn felt a familiar, weary tightening in her chest. She had heard that tone before. It was the tone of someone who had already decided she was a problem, that her presence in this space was an anomaly that needed correcting. "My need is to sit in the seat that is assigned to me on my ticket," Evelyn stated calmly. She refused to let emotion enter her voice. Her entire career was built on maintaining composure under pressure. "If the airline wishes to upgrade this passenger, I'm sure there's a process for that. Perhaps you have another open seat in this cabin." Brenda's eyes narrowed. The pretense of politeness was beginning to crack. "All the other seats are taken by our platinum members," she lied, glancing dismissively at the couple across the aisle. "Look, I don't want to make a scene here. It would be much easier if you would just cooperate." The businessman in 1A, a man named Mr. Davies, lowered his laptop screen slightly, his attention now peaked. The couple across the aisle stopped their cheerful chatter and were now watching the exchange with open curiosity. The quiet peace of the cabin had evaporated, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable silence. "There is no scene to be made," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a low, steady register. "I am sitting in the seat I purchased. I am not moving. That is the end of the discussion." This was a direct challenge to Brenda's authority, and it was one she could not abide. Her face flushed a blotchy red. Tiffany, the young woman, now looked mortified. "It's okay, really," she whispered, tugging on Brenda's arm. "I can just go to my seat." Brenda shook her off, her focus lasered in on Evelyn. "Ma'am, you're creating a disturbance. We have protocols for these situations. This passenger has a valid reason for needing to be moved to the front of the plane." "And what reason is that?" Evelyn asked, her gaze unwavering. Brenda sputtered for a moment, caught off guard. It's a medical issue, a claustrophobia-related anxiety. We are required to make accommodations." It was a weak, transparent lie. A legitimate medical accommodation would have been arranged at the gate, documented and handled with discretion, not improvised by a flight attendant, demanding a forced downgrade from another passenger. Evelyn, whose entire life revolved around regulations and protocols, knew this better than anyone. "If it's a documented medical issue, then the airline should have provided the accommodation," Evelyn replied, her voice still infuriatingly calm. "Demanding another paying customer relinquish their purchased seat is not the proper protocol." Brenda had lost control of the situation, and in a desperate attempt to regain it, she went for the nuclear option. Her voice rose sharp and accusatory, now loud enough for the entire front of the plane to hear clearly. "Ma'am, I have given you a directive. If you refuse to comply, I will have to consider you a non-compliant passenger. We can have you removed from this aircraft before we even leave the gate." "Is that what you want?" The threat hung in the air, thick and ugly. Remove her from the plane. The ultimate humiliation. The implication was clear. You don't belong here, and I have the power to throw you out. Brenda crossed her arms, a smirk of triumph on her face. She believed she had won. She had cornered the woman in 2A, the woman who didn't fit her mental picture of a first-class passenger, and was about to put her firmly in her place. Evelyn Hayes simply looked at her. For a long moment, she said nothing. She let the flight attendant's threat echo in the silent cabin. She watched Brenda's smug expression, the nervous glances from the other passengers. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she reached for her purse. The silence in the cabin was now absolute, broken only by the faint whine of the auxiliary power unit. Every eye was on the woman in seat 2A. Brenda stood her ground, her arms crossed her smirk, solidifying into what she thought was a look of unassailable authority. She had played her final card, and she was waiting for the fold. She expected tears, or angry sputtering, or a grudging, defeated acquiescence. She expected Evelyn to gather her things in shame and perform the walk of shame back to seat 14B. She did not expect what happened next. Evelyn opened her elegant, understated purse. Her movements were fluid and economical, without a hint of fear or agitation. She bypassed her wallet, her phone, her other personal effects. Her fingers found a small black leather credential case. She drew it out the leather, creaking faintly in the quiet cabin. She didn't flip it open with a dramatic flourish. She simply held it in her palm and looked directly into Brenda's eyes. Her own gaze, which had been calm and steady, now carried an intensity that was startling. It was the look of someone whose patience had been exhausted, whose professional core had been breached. "You mentioned protocol," Evelyn said, her voice no longer conversational, but declarative, each word landing with the weight of a judge's gavel. "You mentioned passenger compliance and gate removal. You are correct. There are very specific federal regulations governing these matters. Perhaps we should review them together." With a flick of her thumb, she opened the case. Inside, nestled against a black background, was not a driver's license or a corporate ID. It was a shield of gleaming gold metal embossed with an eagle, and next to it, a photo identification card. The name on the card read, Dr. Evelyn Hayes, and below it, her title, Senior Air Safety Investigator. And at the very bottom, the issuing authority, Federal Aviation Administration, U.S. Department of Transportation. Brenda froze. It was not a gradual process. It was as if a switch had been flipped inside her, cutting power to every muscle and cognitive function. The smug smirk didn't fade. It was flash-frozen on her face, a grotesque mask of shock. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, darted from the golden shield to Evelyn's face and back again. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a pasty, sickly white. The air she had been using to puff out her chest seemed to exit her lungs in a silent, panicked rush. An FAA investigator. Not just any FAA investigator, but a senior one. On her flight. The woman she had just threatened to have removed from the plane for refusing to give up her seat for a non-existent medical emergency was a federal officer whose job was to ensure that airlines and their crews followed safety and security regulations to the letter. Regulations that Brenda had just been either ignoring or fabricating. Evelyn held the credentials steady, letting the reality of the situation sink in. "You cited a medical accommodation requirement." Evelyn continued, her voice a blade of ice. "That would be under Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 382. However, that part also stipulates that an airline is not required to furnish a seat in a class of service other than the one the passenger purchased. Furthermore, attempting to coerce a passenger to switch seats under false pretenses could be interpreted as interference with a crew member, except in this case, it appears to be the crew member. That's you, Ms. Evelyn paused, arching an eyebrow, as if she were a professor asking a failing student a question to which they both knew the answer was pathetic. Brenda's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. A tiny strangled squeak was all she could manage. Her brain was a frantic scramble of error messages. The businessman in 1A, Mr. Davies, let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, a slow grin spreading across his face. He'd seen corporate showdowns, but this was in a league of its own. Tiffany, the young woman who had been the catalyst for the whole ordeal, looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. She took a step back, then another, trying to distance herself from the imploding flight attendant. Evelyn finally closed the credential case with a soft, definitive snap that echoed in the cabin like a gunshot. She placed it back in her purse. "Now," she said, her eyes boring into Brenda's. "I believe you were in the middle of explaining why you were going to have me removed from this aircraft. Please continue. I'm taking notes." She gestured to her own forehead. "Mental ones for now. My official report will be much more detailed." Brenda Miller, the senior flight attendant, the self-proclaimed queen of the cabin, finally broke. Her frozen posture crumbled, her shoulders slumped, and the last vestiges of her authority evaporated, leaving behind only raw, naked panic. She looked at Evelyn, not as a passenger, but as her judge, jury, and executioner, all rolled into one, holding a golden shield that had just brought her entire career to a screeching, fiery halt. The spell of silence was broken by the crackle of the cabin intercom. "Flight attendants, please prepare for door closure," a calm male voice announced. It was the captain. The announcement seemed to jolt Brenda out of her paralytic shock, but only into a state of frantic, disorganized panic. I'm so sorry, Mom. Dr. Hayes." She stammered, her voice a pathetic, quavering whisper. The condescending sweetheart was gone, replaced by a desperate, fawning deference. "There's been a misunderstanding. A terrible misunderstanding." "There has been no misunderstanding," Evelyn stated flatly. "You were perfectly clear. And so was I." Brenda wrung her hands, her eyes darting around as if seeking an escape route. "Please, I was just trying to help the other passenger. I can arrange a voucher for you, some bonus miles for the inconvenience." Evelyn held up a hand, a gesture that immediately silenced her. "Stop talking. Every word you say right now is making this worse for you and for your airline. Go and inform the captain that I wish to speak with him. Now." It was an order, not a request. Brenda, stripped of all authority, simply nodded dumbly and scurried toward the cockpit, her brisk, confident walk replaced by a shuffling, defeated gait. Mr. Davies in 1A leaned over slightly. "That was the most satisfying thing I've seen in 10 years of flying," he said with a chuckle. "I'm David Davies, by the way. I saw the whole thing. If you need a witness, you've got one." "Thank you, Mr. Davies," Evelyn replied with a small, appreciative nod. A moment later, the cockpit door opened. A man with silvering temples and a calm, authoritative demeanor emerged, followed by the visibly trembling Brenda. This was Captain Rodriguez. His face was a mask of professional neutrality, but his eyes, when they met, Evelyn's, held a flicker of deep concern. He'd clearly been given a frantic, terrified summary of the situation. "Dr. Hayes," he began, his voice steady. "I'm Captain Rodriguez. Brenda informed me of the situation. On behalf of Ascend-Air, I want to offer my sincerest apologies for this unacceptable incident." He completely ignored Brenda, who stood behind him, looking like a school child awaiting punishment. "Captain Rodriguez," Evelyn said, her tone respectful but firm. "Your flight attendant Brenda attempted to coerce me out of my paid seat under the false pretense of a medical accommodation. When I refused, she threatened to have me removed from the flight as a non-compliant passenger. Her behavior was not just unprofessional. It was a violation of procedure and a gross abuse of her authority." The captain listened intently, his expression grim. "I understand, and I assure you this will be dealt with immediately and severely. Brenda, go to the galley and stay there until I call for you. Do not interact with any more passengers." Brenda scurried away without a word. "Dr. Hayes," the captain continued, lowering his voice slightly. "We are already behind schedule. Is there anything I can do right now to rectify this to your satisfaction so we can proceed with the flight? I can guarantee you will not be bothered again." Evelyn considered this. Her initial instinct was to deplane and file her report from the ground. But then she thought about the other passengers, the delay, the disruption. And another thought, a more professional one, surfaced. This incident wasn't just about a discriminatory flight attendant. It was a symptom, and her job was to investigate symptoms to find the disease. Staying on the flight would allow her to observe. "I will remain on the flight, Captain," she said. "On 2 conditions. First, that flight attendant has no further contact with me or any other passenger in this cabin. Second, I will require the full names and employee numbers of the entire crew before we land. I will be filing a formal report." Captain Rodriguez nodded without hesitation. "Of course. I'll have that for you personally. Thank you, Dr. Hayes. I appreciate your professionalism." He gave her a respectful nod and returned to the cockpit. The door clicked shut behind him. The flight to San Francisco was for the other passengers largely uneventful. Another flight attendant, a young, nervous man named Paul, took over service in the first-class cabin. He was impeccably polite, treating Evelyn with a cautious deference that bordered on reverence. The story had clearly spread like wildfire among the crew, but for Evelyn the flight was no longer a journey home. It was an investigation. Her trained eyes, which normally would have been focused on her book, were now scanning everything. She saw things the average passenger would miss. A slightly loose latch on an overhead compartment above seat 3B. A worn spot on the carpet that was a potential trip hazard. During the safety briefing, she noted that Paul, in his nervousness, rushed through the instructions for the emergency exit row. She noticed how the other flight attendants seemed to be walking on eggshells, their interactions strained. She saw Brenda once, a fleeting glimpse of her pale, tear-streaked face in the back galley, as she passed by on the way to the lavatory. The woman looked utterly broken. Evelyn felt no pity. She felt a cold, professional resolve. Brenda's actions were not a simple mistake. They were a failure of training, of professionalism, and of basic human decency. And in Evelyn's world, such failures, if left unchecked, could lead to catastrophic consequences. A crew that was sloppy with passenger interaction could be sloppy with safety checks. A culture that allowed bullying in the cabin might allow for cut corners in the maintenance bay. As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, Captain Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit once more. He handed Evelyn a slip of paper with the requested names and numbers. "Dr. Hayes," he said quietly. "For what it's worth, I've been flying for 25 years. I've never seen anything like that. You were right to do what you did. Some people forget that this uniform is about responsibility, not power." Evelyn accepted the paper. "Thank you, Captain. I hope your airline remembers that as well." As she deplaned at SFO, her phone buzzed. It was a text from a colleague at the FAA's Western Pacific Regional Office. "Heard you had an interesting flight. Welcome home. Drinks when you're settled." The wheels were already in motion. This was no longer about a flight attendant named Brenda. This was about an airline named Attendant, and the full weight of the Federal Aviation Administration was about to descend upon them. The morning after her arrival, Evelyn sat in her quiet, sunlit home office overlooking the bay. Her book lay forgotten on the coffee table. In front of her was her laptop displaying the FAA's official incident reporting portal. She spent 3 hours composing her report, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. She detailed the initial confrontation with meticulous, dispassionate clarity. She quoted Brenda's words, verbatim, "Sweetheart, just a seat, non-compliant passenger." She described her tone, her posture, and the threat of removal. She attached a statement from her witness, David Davies, who had eagerly emailed her his contact information and a full account of the events. But the report didn't stop there. This was where Evelyn's true nature as an investigator took over. The incident with Brenda was merely the inciting event, the crack in the facade. She went on to document every other minor discrepancy she had observed. Item 1. Improperly secured overhead bin latch, seat 3B. Potential hazard during turbulence. Item 2. Incomplete safety briefing by Flight Attendant Paul Evans regarding exit row operation. Item 3. Visible carpeting wear near the forward galley constituting a trip and fall hazard. Item 4. Observed poor crew resource management and communication breakdown following the primary incident, indicating potential systemic training deficiencies. She wasn't just reporting a rude flight attendant. She was building a case for a broader, more troubling pattern of laxity. When she finally hit submit, the report was immediately flagged and escalated due to her senior credentials. Within an hour, her phone rang. It was her supervisor, Mark Chen, from Washington, D.C. "Evelyn," he said, his voice grim. "I read your report on Ascendair 812. This is unacceptable." "It's a symptom, Mark," she replied. "You don't get that level of arrogance and procedural ignorance in a vacuum. It points to a cultural problem." "I agree," Mark said. "We're launching a full compliance audit of Ascendair's Atlanta hub, effective immediately, and we're opening a formal investigation into Flight Attendant Brenda Miller. I want you to lead it." "I can't," Evelyn said immediately. "I'm the complainant. It's a conflict of interest. Assign it to the regional office. I'll provide my full cooperation, but this needs to be by the book." Mark sighed. "You're right, of course. Always by the book." "Okay. I'll assign lead to Jack Riley out of the Western Pacific office. But I want you to know the agency has your back on this. Completely." Meanwhile, at the corporate headquarters of Ascendair in Dallas, Texas, Evelyn's report had landed like a bomb. It had bypassed the usual customer service channels and gone straight to the Vice President of In-Flight Services, a slick, hard-charging executive named David Thompson. Thompson was a man who saw passengers not as people, but as revenue-generating units. He saw safety regulations not as sacred rules written in blood, but as inconvenient, cost-adding obstacles to be navigated with minimal compliance. His office was a shrine to corporate achievement awards, but his reputation among the rank and file was that of a ruthless cost-cutter. His first call was to the Atlanta hub manager. "What the hell happened on Flight 812? He barked into the phone. "I've got a report from a senior FAA official on my desk, who is Brenda Miller." The hub manager, a man perpetually stressed by Thompson's budget cuts, explained the situation in halting tones. Thompson listened, his face growing darker with every word. "So let me get this straight," Thompson seethed. "A senior flight attendant with 15 years of service tried to bully a black woman out of a first-class seat, got caught, and it turns out the woman is an FAA investigator. Is that the summary?" "Yes, Mr. Thompson. That's about the size of it." Thompson slammed his hand on his mahogany desk. "Unbelievable. The press would have a field day with this. This is a PR nightmare." He wasn't concerned about the discrimination or the safety violations Evelyn had noted. He was concerned about the stock price. His next move was classic corporate damage control. He instructed the legal department to draft a formal-sounding but hollow apology letter to Dr. Hayes. He then had his assistant dispatch a $1,500 travel voucher to her address. It was a go-away payment, an attempt to treat the problem as a simple customer service complaint. He assumed that, like most people, she had a price. He then dealt with Brenda Miller. He didn't fire her. Firing her would create a paper trail for a wrongful termination suit and would be an admission of guilt. Instead, he had her placed on paid administrative leave pending an internal review. It was a classic corporate maneuver: bury the problem until it goes away. He told the hub manager to make the other minor issues, Evelyn noted, disappear from the records. Fix the latch, replace the carpet, and rebrief the flight attendants. Problem solved. A few days later, a crisp Ascendair envelope arrived at Evelyn's house. She opened it and read the letter signed by David Thompson. It spoke of our commitment to customer satisfaction and falling short of our own high standards. It never once used the words discrimination, threats, or prejudice. The enclosed voucher felt like an insult. Evelyn picked up the phone and called Jack Riley, the lead investigator. "Jack, it's Evelyn Hayes," she said. "Hey, Evelyn, I was just about to call you. We've received Ascendair's official response to our initial inquiry. They're calling it an interpersonal misunderstanding and have placed the flight attendant on leave." Evelyn let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I just received a letter from their VP, David Thompson. They think a $1,500 voucher is going to make this disappear. They've also conveniently failed to address the safety violations I documented." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Jack Riley was a veteran investigator, a man who had seen every trick in the corporate playbook. "So they want to play hardball," Jack said, his voice hardening. "They think this is a PR problem. They're about to find out it's a federal one. Evelyn, they just handed us the justification we need to turn this from a simple compliance audit into a full-scale, top-to-bottom safety and cultural investigation. They just declared war on the wrong person." Evelyn looked out her window at the vast, open sky. "Good," she said, "because I'm ready for a fight." The FAA investigation into Ascendair began not with a bang, but with the quiet, relentless force of a rising tide. Lead investigator Jack Riley assembled a team of specialists experts in maintenance logs, crew training records and human resources protocols. They descended on Ascendair's Atlanta hub and their Dallas headquarters like ghosts, their presence quiet, but their purpose absolute. Their first target was Brenda Miller. Summoned to a sterile conference room at the regional FAA office, Brenda was a shadow of her former self. Her confidence was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate fear. Across the table from her sat two FAA investigators, their faces impassive. A lawyer from the Flight Attendants Union sat beside her, looking grim. The investigators' questions were precise and merciless. Ms. Miller, please describe the events of Flight 812. You cited a medical condition. What was the nature of that condition? Were you aware of Title 14, CFR Part 382, regarding accommodations? Please describe Ascendair's training module on de-escalation. Brenda's story crumbled under the weight of factual scrutiny. Her lies became tangled, her justifications transparent. Under pressure, she admitted she had made an assumption about Tiffany, the other passenger, and had overstated the situation. She tried to paint Evelyn as aggressive and uncooperative, but the testimony of David Davies and the notes from Captain Rodriguez directly contradicted her account. The investigators then pulled her personnel file. It was a revelation. Over her 15-year career, Brenda Miller had accumulated 12 passenger complaints. 9 of those complaints were from minority passengers. Words like condescending, rude, and dismissive appeared again and again. 3 complaints specifically mentioned her trying to get them to move from premium seats. Ascendair's HR department had handled each one with a simple slap on the wrist and a notation in her file. They had seen the pattern and had done nothing. It was a ticking time bomb, and Evelyn Hayes had been the one to finally set it off. Simultaneously, another team was digging into Ascendair's corporate culture, with VP David Thompson as their focus. They subpoenaed internal emails and memos going back 3 years. What they found was damning. They discovered a corporate culture driven from the top by Thompson that prioritized on-time departures and cost savings above all else. They found memos where Thompson railed against excessive training hours, pushing to shorten recurrent training for flight crews to the bare legal minimum. They found emails where he had denied requests for new carpeting on several aircraft, including the one Evelyn was on, dismissing it as a non-essential cosmetic expense. The most damning discovery was what they called the Upgrade Suppression Memo. In it, Thompson had instructed gate agents and flight attendants to avoid giving free operational upgrades to non-revenue or low-status passengers whenever possible, as it devalues the premium cabin product. This memo, while not explicitly discriminatory, had created a culture where crew members like Brenda felt empowered to act as gatekeepers of the first-class cabin, deciding who did and did not belong. It was the corporate policy that had loaded the gun. Brenda Miller had simply pulled the trigger. Back on the ground, Jack Riley's team was auditing the Atlanta maintenance logs. They found the report for the fixed overhead latch on Evelyn's plane. The work order was dated the day after Evelyn's flight. However, it was backdated to appear as if it had been completed the week before. It was a clumsy, blatant act of falsifying a safety record, a cardinal sin in the aviation world. The mechanic, when interviewed, broke down and admitted he had been ordered by the hub manager to fix the paperwork to avoid an FAA write-up. The hub manager in turn confessed he was acting under intense pressure from David Thompson to maintain a clean record. The threads were all coming together, weaving a tapestry of systemic negligence, corporate malfeasance, and a culture of discrimination, all stemming from that one confrontation in seat 2A. The small crack Evelyn had exposed was widening into a chasm threatening to swallow the entire airline. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Tiffany Vance, the young woman Brenda had tried to move, saw a news report about the FAA investigation into Ascendair. Racked with guilt, she contacted the FAA and volunteered to give a statement. She told them that she had never claimed to be claustrophobic or anxious. She had simply asked Brenda if there was any chance of an upgrade because she was on her way to see her mother, who was in the hospital. Brenda had seized on her request, transforming it into a medical necessity and making Tiffany an unwilling pawn in her discriminatory power play. Tiffany's testimony completely obliterated the last shred of Brenda's defense. Jack Riley called Evelyn. "You were right," he said. It was never just about a flight attendant. It was rotten from the top down. Thompson created the environment for this to happen. The falsified maintenance log is the nail in the coffin. We have enough to bring the hammer down. Hard. Evelyn felt a grim sense of validation. This was why she did what she did. It wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. It was about ensuring that the next person who looked like her, who sat in a seat they had earned, would be treated with the dignity and respect they deserved, and that the aircraft they were sitting in was safe not just on paper, but in reality. The karma wasn't just coming for Brenda Miller. It was a storm about to break over all of Ascendair. The conclusion of the FAA's investigation was swift and brutal. It came in the form of a multi-page letter of investigation delivered to the CEO of Ascendair, a document that read like a corporate death sentence. The findings were laid out in cold, bureaucratic language that barely concealed the fury behind them. 1. Systemic failures in crew training and discipline. Citing the case of Brenda Miller and her extensive history of complaints, the FAA found Ascendair's HR and in-flight services divisions to be grossly negligent in addressing repeated patterns of discriminatory behavior. 2. Deliberate falsification of maintenance and safety records. The backdated work order for the overhead latch was a federal offense. This single finding triggered an automatic and massive financial penalty. 3. A corporate culture fostered by senior management that prioritized profits over federally mandated safety and passenger welfare regulations. The FAA cited David Thompson's memos as direct evidence of this, creating an environment that encouraged procedural corner-cutting and confrontation. 4. Violations of Title 14, CFR Part 382, regarding passenger rights. The actions of Brenda Miller were officially ruled as a discriminatory and coercive attempt to illegally deny a passenger her purchased accommodation. The consequences were devastating for Ascendair. The FAA levied a civil penalty of $2.8 million against the airline, one of the largest fines of its kind in recent years. They were also placed under a consent decree for a period of 2 years, which meant that every aspect of their training, maintenance, and HR procedures would be subject to direct and intrusive FAA oversight. It was a public humiliation and a crippling financial blow. The karma for the individuals involved was just as severe and deeply personal. Brenda Miller was the first to fall. Her employment with Ascendair was terminated. More importantly, based on the findings of gross misconduct and her demonstrated lack of professional judgment, the FAA revoked her flight attendant certification permanently. After 15 years in the sky, she was grounded for life, her career over in the most disgraceful way imaginable. She would never work as a flight attendant in the United States again. The hub manager in Atlanta, who ordered the falsification of the maintenance log, was fired and faced potential federal charges. The mechanic who complied was suspended and forced into a rigorous retraining and ethics program. And then there was David Thompson. The release of the FAA report was leaked to a major news organization, likely by a vindicated employee within Ascend-Air. The story exploded. Ascend-Air fined millions for discrimination and safety cover-up, screamed the headlines. The article detailed the entire story, from the confrontation with Dr. Evelyn Hayes to the rot discovered in the executive suite. Thompson's name and his cost-cutting memos were front and center. Ascend-Air's stock plummeted 15% in a single day. The board of directors, facing a shareholder revolt and a PR catastrophe, had no choice. David Thompson was forced to resign, in disgrace, his golden parachute ripped away, due to the for-cause nature of his departure. His career in aviation was over. A week later, Evelyn received a personal hand-delivered letter. It was from the new interim CEO of Ascend-Air. The letter was a stark contrast to the one from Thompson. It was deeply, profoundly apologetic. It acknowledged the discrimination she faced without reservation and detailed the sweeping changes the airline was now forced to implement, from top-to-bottom diversity and inclusion training to a complete overhaul of their safety reporting system. He invited her to act as a paid consultant to help them reform their culture. She politely declined. Her work was already done. The final piece of closure came in the form of an email with the subject line, "Thank you." It was from Tiffany Vance. She apologized profusely for her role in the incident and thanked Evelyn for standing her ground. "You taught me something important that day," she wrote. "You don't have to be loud to be strong. Thank you for being strong." Evelyn sat in her office looking out at the sky. She felt no joy, no sense of victory, only a solemn satisfaction. A wrong had been righted. A system had been held accountable. The sky was just a little bit safer, a little bit fairer than it had been a few weeks ago. Her simple act of refusal, of calmly holding her ground and revealing her identity, had triggered an avalanche of consequence. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary act is to simply insist on occupying the space you have earned, and to never ever let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. A year had passed. The seasons had turned, and the world had moved on as it always does. The Ascend-Air scandal had faded from the headlines, replaced by the next corporate crisis, the next political drama. But in the aviation industry, the echoes of Flight 8112 remained. The FAA's enforcement action was now informally known as the Ascend-Air Decree. A cautionary tale whispered in training rooms and crew lounges from Seattle to Miami. Airlines across the country had quietly reviewed and reinforced their own anti-discrimination and passenger interaction protocols. The ripples from that one confrontation in Seat 2A had in their own small way changed the landscape. Dr. Evelyn Hayes was in Chicago on a layover after a week-long aircraft accident investigation in Detroit. Her work had not changed, but her profile within the industry had. She was no longer anonymous. Captains sometimes recognized her name on the manifest and would make a point of coming out to greet her with a palpable, almost nervous respect. Flight attendants were unfailingly, meticulously professional in her presence. She had become something of a legend, a reputation she neither sought nor particularly enjoyed. It made her job of quiet observation more difficult. She was sitting in the lobby bar of her airport hotel, a glass of water and a plate of appetizers in front of her, reviewing preliminary findings on her tablet. The low murmur of conversations and the clinking of glasses provided a soothing background hum. She was tired, and the thought of her own bed in San Francisco was a powerful lure. "Can I get you anything else, ma'am?" The voice was tentative, hoarse, and strangely familiar. Evelyn looked up from her screen, her mind still on thrust-to-weight ratios and metallurgical failure. Standing by her table was a woman in the hotel staff's standard-issue black polo shirt and apron. Her blonde hair was no longer in a severe, shellacked bun, but pulled back in a simple, limp ponytail. Her face was pale thinner than Evelyn remembered, and etched with lines of exhaustion. The wide, false smile was gone, replaced by a vacant, weary expression. But the eyes were the same. Evelyn would never forget those eyes. It was Brenda Miller. For a moment, the world seemed to slow down. The ambient noise of the bar faded into a dull roar. Evelyn saw not a hotel employee, but the ghost of her antagonist, the woman whose smug confidence had shattered into 1,000,000 pieces when faced with a small golden shield. There was no uniform, no authority, no airplane cabin to command. There was only a woman wiping down a table, a damp rag in her hand. Brenda recognized her at the same moment. A flicker of panic, then shame, then a deep, soul-crushing resignation passed through her eyes. She froze her hand, hovering over the table as if she had seen an apparition. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked as though she might bolt, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. Evelyn maintained her composure, her face a mask of professional neutrality. She simply held Brenda's gaze, waiting. It was Brenda who finally broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper. "Dr. Hayes." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of exhausted surrender. "Hello, Brenda," Evelyn replied, her tone even. Brenda flinched at the sound of her own name, a name she now associated with public disgrace. She clutched the rag in her hand like a lifeline. I don't know what to say." "There's nothing that needs to be said," Evelyn said, preparing to return to her work to end the deeply uncomfortable encounter. "No, please," Brenda said, taking a half step closer. Her eyes were glassy with unshed tears. "I have to. I need to. What I did to you that day, it wasn't about a seat. It wasn't about another passenger. It was about me. I saw you sitting there, and I made a judgment. A horrible, ugly judgment. I thought you didn't belong." Her voice cracked on the last word. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. And I am so sorry. Not just because I lost my job. I'm sorry for what I did to you." The confession hung in the air between them. It was the truth, stripped bare of all the lies and justifications she had tried to build around it. It was the admission Evelyn had never asked for, but which, in a way, was the final piece of the story. Evelyn studied the woman before her. She felt no anger. The fire of indignation had burned out long ago, replaced by the cold ashes of consequence. She saw no monster, only a broken person living with the wreckage of her own prejudice. There was no satisfaction in this, no triumphant feeling of victory. There was only a profound and heavy sadness. "Consequences are a part of life, Miss Miller," Evelyn said, finally, her voice calm and measured. "The most we can hope for is to learn from them." Brenda nodded, wiping a tear from her eye with the back of her hand. "They fired Mr. Thompson, you know," she said quietly. "He lost everything too. All because of me." "No." Evelyn corrected her gently, but with an unyielding firmness. "He lost his job because of his own choices, the decisions he made, the culture he created. You were a product of that culture, but you made your own choices too. We all do." Evelyn picked up her tablet and placed it in her briefcase. The conversation was over. "Good luck to you, Brenda," she said, leaving a $20 bill on the table for her water. She stood up her tall frame, seeming to command the space around her. She walked out of the bar without looking back, leaving Brenda standing amidst the tables, a ghost from a past that had been fully and finally laid to rest. As Evelyn headed towards the elevator, she felt not triumph, but a quiet finality, The score had been settled long ago in reports and boardrooms. This final human echo was just a sad footnote. Karma, she reflected, wasn't always a roaring fire. Sometimes it was just the quiet, lonely sound of a woman wiping down tables in a hotel bar, living a life she had made for herself, one terrible judgment at a time. And that's where the story of Flight 812 ends. It started with a single act of prejudice, a flight attendant who saw a black woman in first class and decided she didn't belong. But she didn't just challenge a passenger, she challenged a professional whose entire life was dedicated to upholding the very rules she was breaking. The karma that followed wasn't just a firing, it was a systemic cleansing. A toxic employee lost her career, a corrupt executive lost his position, and a negligent airline was brought to its knees and forced to change. It's a powerful lesson in how standing your ground with quiet dignity and unwavering professionalism can be more powerful than any angry outburst. What Dr. Evelyn Hayes proved is that the best defense is competence, and the ultimate authority comes not from a uniform, but from the truth. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more true stories of justice and karma. Let us know in the comments, what would you have done in her situation?